Okay, tell me when you're ready. Shalom and welcome to the very first installment of our series, The Truths We Believe in. Today I want to talk to us about life after death. And under the current situation that most of you, this video comes to you when you're in lockdowns across the world, and it's difficult. You're trying to figure out what to do, you're trying to figure out how to survive. And in most cases, some people are in worse off than the rest of us who can sit in a comfortable place and perhaps wait for the pandemic to pass, or so we hope. And so I want to talk to us about something that's more fundamental than what we are looking for at the moment. We are scrambling, and I've heard, certainly in South Africa, a lot of people suggesting that we look forward to the 16th or the end of the lockdown. I've had people call me and tell me how desperate they are to just see the pandemic pass. But I want to give us my job, and my role as a minister of the gospel is to remind us of the truths we believe in, that this is not just about the pandemic, which is why I want us to talk about eternal life that is beyond the bios, the life as we experience it here and now. What is interesting at the moment is that the frustration, the fear, the anxiety, it is all about this life. How can I keep this life a little bit more comfortable? Or in most cases, it has been that my life has been so uncomfortable during this time and fearful that I long to go back to a much more convenient life that I had before the disruptions started with the pandemic. But the Bible has something to say about how we need to view this life. And it's found in the book of Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27. I want to read for us briefly, and I'll explain the implications of this on us at the moment. It says as follows. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27. And as it is appointed for man to die once, but after this the judgment. So here is an interesting account. If you read the book of Hebrews, the whole of chapter 9, it's talking about Christ, of course. It goes on to talk about his sacrifice and his death. And there is an insertion here in verse 27 that deviates from what the author of Hebrews has been talking about and focuses specifically on a principle, which is an appointment of death, and after this, judgment. Our philosophers, and a lot of us on a daily basis, we struggle with this, and philosophers have struggled with this question of life and death over centuries. We go back, way back to the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who lived around late 1500s and died about 1679. His argument, essentially, in grappling with this question of life, was that human life is essentially short, it is miserable, it is crude, it is violent and cruel. And his idea was you need civilization, you need governments and laws to try and constrain self-interests which emerge out of that kind of a bleak outlook of life. In other words, his argument was, because our lives are short and crude and cruel and difficult, we do everything we can to maximize what we can within the period that we can, even though we do not know that period. And so that was his argument, that we need civilization. In other words, he was grappling with the solution to the misery of human life. We fast forward to the Geneva philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived around 1712 to 1778. His argument was that, well, man is actually born free. We are born much more happier, and later on in life, because of reasoning and arts and science, we become changed and life becomes very miserable. And so for him, there was such an outlook that it's inevitable that we will become miserable along the way. And then back to Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, his argument was that in surveying life of the Western culture at the time and the Eastern culture, he came to a conclusion that life was meaningless. And in each of those cases, you and I can grapple with what's going on now, and perhaps come to those conclusions that what is it about all this? But the Bible has something to say beyond that crisis. And this is what Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27 talks about God's appointment. It's appointed once for a man to die, and after that judgment. And I want us to perhaps just in a minute look at what that exactly means. If you look at the declaration there, it is appointed. That word is much more of a passive word. It actually is better translated as apportioned or reserved or laid up. In other words, you don't have to do anything, but you and I will have to face this appointment. It's appointed once for a man to die. And when he talks about man, of course, he talks about Anthropos. And he goes on to talk about after death, there is judgment. The word used for judgment in the Greek is crisis. It's appointed once for a man to die, and after that, there is judgment. This essentially tells us that there is something beyond what we are going through now. There is a life that is beyond this life. It's appointed, which means you and I and everybody else has to face God's tribunal when we die. It's appointed once for a man to die, and after that there is judgment. We must face that tribunal. The question though is whether we have lived a life that pleases God and whether we have accepted Christ or not. And if not, you can only imagine the outcome of that judgment. And so we need to live, even under the current situations, we need to live this life knowing that it's not about the preservation of what we have now. It's not about the misery we have now. There is, and even now as we try as much as we can to protect ourselves, you realize that it is futile. At some point, that appointment will come. The question is, am I ready to face God's tribunal? If you do not have Christ, you are not ready to face God's tribunal, because the outcome of that judgment is eternal misery, which, if you compare with the life here on earth, this world and this life is a luxury resort compared to life in hell.